Hi, I am Benet Davetian, and this is the sixth installment in a series of lectures on organizations. The title of this one, briefer than the others, is Organizations and Environments, the networking aspect of organizations. When we think of organizations, we tend to think of a closed system, that one organization or that one institution, be they profit or non-profit. But there are environments occupied by many organizations, and these organizations are linked in a way, maybe not directly, they may not even communicate together, but they are linked through an invisible network, if you want, and visible sometimes, that makes them an environmental presence. So let's see what we mean by all these words. Organizations have spheres of interaction and ways of defining themselves. So the questions that we need to ask in order to do research and to understand organizational life is, how do organizations relate to one another? How do they become similar or dissimilar from one another? Let's take universities, for example. Let's take the Maritimes. There's a certain similarity or some kind of social bond between universities that are in the Canadian Maritime region. Now, if we go further south in the United States, we may see a bonded environment of universities in certain regions that would differ from our own. If we were to go to New England, we would see certain aspects of the smaller universities there that we may recognize from our own region here. Now, I don't know if this is because of cultural background of the original people who settled in these areas. I don't want to go that far, but we will see similarities. We will feel that there are certain vibrations, if you want, if I may use that sort of new agey word, that are present as we compare these institutions across cultural borders. And these similarities may be higher than if we compared universities in the maritime regions with universities way out west in Canada. So the national location of institutions is not as determinant on, it's not as determining factor on their similarity or dissimilarity. These are dependent on factors of definitions and assumptions that the organizations themselves make. A given type of organization, let's say organizations that produce knowledge and facilities for sheltering the homeless, let's just take that, will share characteristics that make them structurally more similar than if we were to take one of those organizations and compare them to an organization that sells aerospace technology. So organizations are defined more by what happens inside, but also what happens outside their borders. To determine what is similar and what is dissimilar, you have to see what is happening inside this organizational network or sphere and compare it to what is happening outside of it. I hope this is clear. What I'm saying here is that the externals of an organization are an open system, whereas the organization itself may be a closed system. It is living in an open system, and it is in relation to that open system, and it is affecting it and is being affected by it. We've said this before. In a way, we're being repetitive here. because we are trying to remember that there are closed systems and open systems, and these have different influences and different driving forces. They do not exist in isolation. The relationship to one another and to the environment which we would call our institutional society, or the organization society, is an interactive relationship. It is a mutually interactive, mutually affecting. It is a field in a way. There is a field at work. If you were to imagine loops of energy crisscrossing one another, going away from one another, coming back again, crisscrossing, these loops of energy, you'd get an idea of how different clusters of organizations, and I'm moving my hands like this on purpose, I haven't gone crazy, are always moving around, and this is, if you want, the entire network at play. So nothing exists in isolation. If you take movies, for example, if you look at the 60s and 70s, the movies that started coming out, some of them were groundbreaking. There were films that came out that were very original. They were the first to address social issues in dramatic environments. But then soon, the whole field of Hollywood, there was a similarity between what directors were doing. They were addressing cultural issues, individual issues, social issues, where, in a way, the films of the 60s and early 70s became social commentaries. Today, the film industry is different. Much of the product is there to entertain. We're into action films. We're into animation. It's a totally different environment. And the more we produce those films, the more they engender films that, in a way, repeat, that are similar to what has come before. So keep that in mind. Similarity and dissimilarity exist, but they're also affected by what has come before. We are similar to something, or different, dissimilar from something. So it just doesn't happen just like that. It happens after a long process of, again, this kind of activity here that creates a field. Norbert Elias, the great sociologist, he worked in Britain his life. He wrote The Civilizing Process, a classic work which appears in my own book, Civility. He said that we should have a field effect sociology, that sociology should be studying fields of influence. Because in a certain given reality, social reality, you can have thousands and thousands of possible outcomes. You combine the effects of one thing with another and another thing. This is what really multivariate analysis is looking at a tremendous large number of variables and saying, well, what needs to arrive before what, and what network relationship do they have to have together to produce this total effect that we're going to observe. That is why, for example, in government, in the American government, you have so many lobbyists always working with the government to convince, legislators and people that are influential in the government to choose policies and attitudes, ideologies that benefit the people they represent. A lobbyist is always lobbying for their client. So the activity is external. The information is an external resource. But the placement of the goal, if you want, is internal. The lobbyist and the corporation that they are representing as specialists, as experts. So an organization's activities, be they local, regional, overseas, create what we call the type of organization that it is. And if we're going to do business with that organization, we have to understand that type. American companies went to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Russia welcomed capitalism and investments and tried to open branches there and tried partnerships. They had a tremendous amount of difficulty because they went in with the American environment, not realizing that the Russian environment, which was in development in terms of business, nothing was very clear on how you did things. Government regulations were still there, and some of them were more than they needed to be. Many of these companies just gave up. They withdrew. They said, we can't do business here. But I'm not sure that all of them understood that in order to do the business, you have to project into that external environment that you're approaching and understand your own environment and say, how could these two network together? We cannot be similar, but how can we, in our dissimilarity and our differences, establish common bonds of energy, structure, and activity? Corporations seek stable political environments to do business in for the one reason that it helps you plan ahead. I mean, if a government's changing the rules every 2-3 days, for a corporation, it is extremely difficult to have long-range plans because you don't know what the rules are going to be tomorrow. And a structure that you put in, a practice, could be illegal in 4 days if that government is unstable and is just making up rules as they go along, right? So, somewhere in all this seeming chaos, if you want, which is called world global business, and a lot of it is nonprofit institutions, you have at the institutional level a looking outwards to further promote the image of the organization at the managerial level and at the technical level, but also what is needed is a looking outward in order to bring in to the organization expertise and knowledge about what lies out there. If I want to do business with organization B, I need to know about organization B, and I also should know about organization C that is doing business with B, and maybe even D that's doing business with C. You see, this is the concept that field effect, knowledge of an entire sort of galaxy of institutions is needed to understand the rocky and troublesome terrain that navigating in them can become. So you need good network analysts. And by network, I'm not talking your computer network. I'm talking about networks that are visible as well as invisible. You need people that understand links and what are involved in links at the human interaction level, which we would call social bonds, and at the institutional level, which we would call structural bonds or structural compatibilities. Another part of relations that are important that are studied are interorganizational relations. These internal processes of an organization can be very different from their relationships with other organizations. Different approaches may be needed. What is the key factor in any kind of linking or networking is that there has to be legitimacy. It has to be accepted as a legal and rational, if you want, and viable way of interaction and interconnection. So innovation can occur internally as well as in our links with other organizations. And the translation of an innovation that happens, let's say, in a meeting with organization B and C, and then bring that back into one's own organization and implementing it, may require a very mature, a very deep, and creative understanding of how things transform and how they need to be transformed to be relevant locally. They say, think locally, act globally. That statement has never been very clear. We should say, I think, more think globally before acting locally. That's, to me, makes more sense. So we're looking at forms, we're looking at functions, and we're looking at ideologies. Very important. Uh, if you wonder, by the way, in these lectures, why I'm looking aside with my eyes, there's a reason. I find it very strange to sit in a room talking to myself. So I have a picture that I put there, a picture of somebody taken from a magazine or whatever, and I pretend I'm talking to that person. So I will glance at the picture, and sometimes I have another picture on that side, two pictures, and that makes me feel that you are here. And the reason that the camera is very close in the face is because I find that if I stand in a room talking at a lecture podium and that is filmed, it is very easy for the viewer, for you, to drift during the lecture because there's somebody standing there walking around and they're small on your screen and you can escape, you can daydream. Here, there's no escaping. We're here, one to one. I love it. Thank you for being here. Lecture number 7 will be next.